Welcome to Watercolor Wellness. You will need brushes. Soft synthetic brushes work best. You'll need several flats and round in various sizes. Paint. Tubes or palettes work. I prefer tubes because you can squeeze out the paint onto your palette. You only need a few colors for these exercises. Put water in a cup. Paper. Any paper for wet media will work. 140 pounds is usually good. You can use hot press or cold press paper. Hot press is smooth and cold press has a tooth. You'll need a pencil and an eraser, a palette for mixing colors. Optional tools are masking tape, Q-tips, a dish towel or paper towel, we're gonna prep our palette to paint. You can pick a few colors and you want to mix up the colors with a lot of water. For this first exercise, I'm going to be working with one color. So I'm mixing up a blue on my palette and adding water. And I'm using a round brush first, practicing my pressure and adding different amounts of water. This will help you get a feel for the right ratio of water to paint. You can use your brush on the paper with water first and then add pigment back in. I'm going to try different brushes and see what strokes I can get. This is a flat 1-inch brush, and I'm using the tip and the whole brush. Now I'm going to go back in with a smaller detail brush. With the smaller brushes, you have to be constantly aware of dipping your brush back in the water each time you do a stroke. The more pigment you use, the more vibrant the color. The more water you use, the lighter the color. And I'm just going to keep going on this paper, trying different strokes and shapes with my different brushes. You can try turning your brush, trying different sides. And each time getting different results. Practicing strokes like this on an exercise helps you gain control of your brush and decide what effects you like. You can also practice the pressure of which you apply the brush to the paper. Now I'm going to mix a different color into this turquoise on my palette. When you're applying a brush stroke, you can work from light to heavy pressure. The heavier you put down the brush on the paper, the more control you have of the stroke. With light pressure, you tend to get more pigment that pools on the paper, which can lead to interesting effects. This is important when you're using a flat brush for gradient washes, which we'll go over later. Go back in with my flat brush, applying a pretty heavy pressure in one stroke. You can see how my brushstroke touched the previous one, so the colors will bleed together. I'm going to do another stroke with my flat brush. With heavy pressure, you get an uneven distribution of paint throughout the stroke. Now I'm going to go back in with a small round brush and try the same technique, heavy and light pressure. Blending colors together. I'm going to do some circles on my paper. First, mixing up an orange color, so red and yellow. I'm trying to keep the paint pretty even here. Then I'm going to go back into my palette with a blue. I'm mixing turquoise and viridian blue here. And I'm going to do another circle shape close to the orange and just touch the edge of the orange circle. Because the orange circle is wet, the color will bleed and blend together with the blue circle. This creates a transition in colors, and it's completely organic based on the amount of water you have in the previous circle. I'm going to speed this up a little bit, continuing to practice circles and blending colors together, introducing some reds to my palette. letting two colors blend within the individual circles, and then letting the circles touch and blend with their opposites. Now we'll use negative space. Pause the video and draw some shapes on your paper like you see on the screen. We'll use these shapes as guides for where the paint touches the pencil marks. This is so the colors do not touch one another and do not bleed. On your bottom pie shape, you're going to take two colors and blend them into each other on the palette, each time adding a little bit more of the second color to the first. Now we're going to experiment with blooms. Draw a circle on your paper, and then you're just going to get your brush really, really wet and drop paint into the painted circle. You can also reverse this, so do your circle with water first, and then drop the pigment into the circle. Gradient washes. Here we're going to take a smaller flat brush and do wet paint on dry paper. Now I'm going to do another stroke, adding water first and then going back into my pigment. The more water you have, the less control, but also the more interesting results. Now I'm going to use a lot of water and try and blend the colors on my paper instead of my palette. Now we're going to do a wet and a dry technique. You're going to draw two squares on your paper, one for wet and one for dry. I'm going to spend some time here prepping my palette, making sure that I have plenty of wet paint mixed up. Taking the time to prepare your palette and the colors you want to use in a painting is worthwhile. Here I'm working with just a turquoise color, and I'm making sure that I have plenty of wet, even paint in the pool of the palette. You're going to take a different brush and dip it into the water. You want to cover the wet square with clean water. So I'm going to cover the whole square here. Then I'm going to go back in with my flat brush that I mixed the color in with on my palette. I'm going to load up the brush, and then I'm going to work from left to right at the top of the square. Then I'm going to continue going about halfway down the square on my paper. Then I'll let the piece dry and let the water move the paint around. Next, I'm going to do the dry square. So this is just wet paint from my palette on dry paper. So this is called a wet on dry technique. Each time I'm going to dip my brush into the water to take off a little bit of the pigment and do a new stroke. This creates a slight gradient. As each time I dip my brush back into the water, I'm removing a little bit of pigment. And we're going to work the whole square with this technique. Adding details. On one of your previous exercises that is dry, you're going to go back in with a small round brush and a dark color on your palette. Here I'm using violet. And I'm just going to add some details to my circles. Dots. You can use crosshatch. You can outline some of the circles. This is how we add details to a finished painting on a second dry layer. And you can experiment with different textures to get different results. In watercolor, we always work from light to dark, so you want to take your lightest color and then transition into your dark areas of your painting. This creates a transparency. And mixing different colors on dry colors will produce different results as well. Now we're going to combine all the techniques we've been over in a challenge. We're going to do a watercolor that is underwater. So take a moment to pause the video and draw your jellyfish and seaweed outlines. First, we're going to go back in to the background with the gradient wash technique. And I'm keeping the area around the jellyfish pretty light. And then using my pencil outlines as guides, I'm going to keep the color palette pretty simple, blues and greens. And then on the jellyfish, I'm going to work from light to dark. So going in with a very light color and using my wet on wet technique. When an area is dry, you can touch the edge of the background and the work won't bleed. I'm going to continue to work on the seaweed areas this way, using negative space if the area isn't dry. Then I'm going to go in with some tentacles for the jellyfish, using my brush control. I'm going to add some dimension to the top of the jellyfish, letting the colors bleed a little. If I make a mistake, I can go back in with a Q-tip to remove and lift the wet area, but you want to do it pretty quickly. When an area is dry, I can add details to bring more life to the jellyfish. I can continue my details here, adding areas where the color transitions, and then go back in a pen for even finer details. You're all done.